chan chan le daba pena. Gózalo. Ya entonces no voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. Ya entonces no voy para Marcané, llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí.
Cuba is so rich in culture. I've seen modern dance and classical ballet, and the best thing about Cuba really is the warm people and the culture here. So from the moment we arrived in Cuba, I met with many, many strong women, and then I went to a university where they were teaching teachers.
Moral is that we teachers are always working.
But it's so great to be here today. As you know, education is the key to a better future for yourselves and your family. Cuba is full of strong women, and it's so great to see because they're role models for next generations of young Cuban girls. We saw the United States play Cuba. It was just great to see athletes and meet with them and meet with their team and see our team. That's one of the things this visit is all about. It's all about the relationships, whether it's athletes, whether it's artists, whether it's dancers, whether it's singers. It's the cultural relationship that the United States has with Cuba.
So we've got that other, whoa, this isn't supposed to happen. Let me see if I can stop that. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, now we should be back to, we have 234 people on, and if I can take off that extra column, then we're back to the speakers. So welcome to the 235 of you who are on the call right now. Let me just say a couple of introductory things. What you were just watching was a video that the White House made of Jill Biden's visit to Cuba after the Obama visit, which I don't remember the media ever noting, but I discovered it by chance and have distributed as widely as I can because I think it's a lovely expression of what the US and Cuba were reaching between the two countries at that point. When President Obama was elected, the first weeks afterwards, the first transition was full of stories from anonymous and sometimes identified sources that basically predicted that he was not going to do what he said he was going to do during the campaign, or urged him not to do it. And that was he was going to end all restrictions on travel for Cuban Americans and all restrictions on remittances. In fact, Obama went ahead and did those things almost, I forget exactly when after taking office, but reasonably quickly, and ignored the people who were trying to discourage that. Well, when Joe Biden was elected, we saw exactly the same thing happen in the first days after his election, with anonymous sources of advisors, diplomatic advisors, or even penned articles saying that that Biden would do almost nothing because of his concern for domestic politics. There was a whole piece in the Washington Post arguing that a news article saying that because of the election results with Cuban Americans, he wouldn't do anything because of his concern for 4 years from now. Inevitably, in any transition, there's discussion. They have to figure out what of their campaign promises are important or how important they are relative to other campaign promises, and priorities have to be set. But there's also debate that takes place because of people's pre-existing politics or ideology about Cuba and US relations with Cuba. And some that take place just on a tactical assessment of how to advance the broader agenda of the incoming administration. And obviously that's particularly complicated in this transition between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. I guess the premise that we would like to start from is that we are in what Robert Malley described in the New York Times several weeks ago as a ripe fruit position, that Cuba is something that the Biden team can move very quickly on, achieve a big accomplishment with, and then go on to other more complicated tasks. But we'll see. People may have different opinions on this webinar. Our speakers, if you've looked at the information sheet, the blog, you'll see bios for all of them. I will just mention them right now, and we'll go pretty directly from one to the other. Bill LeoGrande is, I don't know if he wants to be called the Dean of Scholars in US Cuban relations, but he's certainly one of the most highly regarded academics that focus on this particular set of issues. Collin Laverty has started out as an intern in the Center for Democracy in the Americas. It was the first time we met, but has based himself in Havana and has become a very successful entrepreneur of travel, and also has gotten into promoting culture, which he may say some things about in terms of what he's brought to the United States from Cuba. Rita McNiff is more recently in this picture and focuses more on the smaller scale travel. Both of them live in Havana most of the time. So they're bringing, thanks to the marvels of Zoom, bringing a direct view of what's going on in Cuba today. We have one other speaker, Tom Popper, who apparently has had some technical problem, but he will hopefully be on before the program is over. And we will then introduce our co-sponsor, CREST, which is represented by Greg Miller, its president. So, Bill, it's yours, and people have or let me say technically two more things. People have the option on view to determine whether they want to see all of us in the same size or go into a picture with the speaker with everybody else as a small picture around the edge. If you have questions, please use the Q&A for questions. Don't use the chat for questions. I leave the chat open so people can communicate with each other, venture their opinions on what's been said or things that they want to add to what's been said. But if you want a question to be answered, put it in Q&A or it will not necessarily be seen. The Q&A and the chat and the whole event will be available online afterwards, and everybody who's registered will get that option. Did I introduce Jack? No. Jack is an old friend from the American Friends Service Committee who will be doing the fun job of stopping people when their time runs out or warning them that their time is about to run out. So Bill has an opening 15 minutes because he has a very big topic to cover. Go ahead.
Thanks, John. I'm not sure I'll use the whole time because I'm sure that with this knowledgeable audience, we'll have a lot of questions. Let me start out by thanking everyone for joining us this evening. It's really appropriate to be holding this discussion on how to re-engage with Cuba after the Trump administration on the 6th anniversary of President Obama and President Raul Castro announcing their intention to normalize relations. As it happens, I was in Havana at the time of the announcement at a conference discussing U.S.-Cuban relations, a conference of Cuban academics and U.S. academics. And I have to say that the reaction of the Cuban people to this news was incredibly moving. People were really ecstatic, hugging each other, crying. Church bells rang across the city, and it was like a war had ended, which for them, in a sense, it had. A Cold War that had an incredible impact on their daily lives that had lasted, almost 60 years. It's sobering to realize that most Cubans alive today have lived under US sanctions their entire lives. So on a similar note, Cubans reportedly celebrated in the streets when word of Biden's election reached Havana. So John has asked me to talk about some of the damage that Donald Trump has done to the bilateral relationship, especially to travel opportunities, and then what we might expect from the Biden administration in terms of restoring a policy of engagement and reopening particularly travel. So as most of you know, restricting travel was one of Trump's main objectives in the broader policy of trying to cut off Cuba's foreign exchange earnings. And so the other pieces of that policy were putting severe limits on remittances and the ability of Cuban Americans to send remittances to the island, trying to cut off the money Cuba earns from the export of medical services, and then trying to interdict Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba. But the travel piece of this, the tourism piece, was a very big one because, as most of you probably know, Cuba's tourism industry is now one of the main pillars of the economy, and they earn a little over $3 billion a year from foreign visitors. And so to stop the visitors from the United States, the number of which, by the way, had expanded dramatically since Obama announced the normalization of relations, it began to take limitations off of the American people's right to travel. Trump turned around and reimposed them, and reimposed, in some ways, even harsher limitations than had existed before Obama. So, of course, he eliminated the people-to-people category of travel entirely. First, he limited it by just doing away with individual people-to-people travel. But then in 2019, they eliminated that category of travel in its entirety. They restricted academic exchanges, returning to the policies that George W. Bush had in place, which made it very hard for universities to mount academic exchanges because you had to adhere to very, very restrictive rules that just didn't fit the way in which most universities do study abroad. The Trump administration prohibited participation in most cultural events and athletic events. It severed the air links outside Havana, both commercial and charter. It ended cruises and ended visits by all private vessels coming from the United States. And then most recently prohibited travelers from the United States from staying in government-owned hotels, which of course is almost all of the hotels in Cuba. Now, an individual traveler, of course, can stay at a casa particular, which is a great thing to do, and I recommend it to people, but large groups going down can't easily do that. And so prohibiting people from staying in hotels was a real blow to larger visiting groups. And finally, of course, we have to mention the downsizing of the embassies, both the US Embassy in Havana and the Cuban Embassy here in Washington, because it made, because along with that came the closure of the consular sections. And that meant that being able to organize any kind of cultural exchange or academic exchange became incredibly difficult. So the impact of this on Cuba was that from the time that the most severe travel sanctions went into force, which was in November of 2019, up until Cuba had to close the island because of COVID, the number of foreign visitors fell by about 20% in early 2020. So that would have been in itself a really important and painful blow to the tourism sector. But of course, as we know, COVID closed the tourist sector completely, and only just very recently has it gradually begun to reopen. So what can President Biden do to repair the damage done by Donald Trump to our right to travel and to the bilateral relationship more broadly? And I want to start by saying there are two things that are really pretty straightforward and simple and easy and could be done right away. The quickest and most effective would be to order the Department of the Treasury to restore the Cuban assets control regulations to the language that was in force on January 19th, 2017. And I think we should all be encouraging the new administration to do exactly that. That would wipe out almost all of the travel restrictions that President Trump put in place. And then equally important would be bringing the embassies back to full staff, reopening the consular sections so that you have diplomats in country that you can speak with about organizing cultural tours, exhibitions, academic exchanges, and so on. So at this point, I want to put in a plug for a broader roadmap for Biden Cuba policy that I worked on in conjunction with the Washington Office on Latin America and the Center for Democracy in the Americas. We released it just today, and John has been kind enough to put a link to it in the chat. And it's a fairly detailed report. It covers diplomatic engagement, what could be done to restore diplomatic engagement, what could be done to restore civil society engagement, which is to say travel, educational exchange, cultural exchange, and family ties. And finally, what could be done to restart commercial engagement with Cuba, which was just beginning to get underway when Trump came in and closed that down. So that briefing book includes a complete list of all of Trump's sanctions and what could be done to reverse them. And then it recommends some additional steps to carry a policy of engagement beyond what President Obama was able to achieve in just 2 years. But that, of course, leaves us with the question of what is the Biden administration actually likely to do? It's important to note that the president-elect's own personal instincts are very good. At every point during the campaign, when he was asked a question about his Cuba policy, he said that he intended to return to a policy of engagement. Sometimes he said explicitly to Obama's policy of engagement. Now, the campaign itself was intentionally short on specifics about this because of their concerns about the political impact in South Florida. But over the course of the campaign, they made 3 points repeatedly. First, that a Biden administration would in fact re-engage with Cuba diplomatically to talk about issues of mutual interest, that they would reverse Trump sanctions that have harmed Cuban families. First and foremost, I presume, would be remittances. And finally, that they would restore travel because, as the candidate Biden said, Americans are the best ambassadors for freedom. Now, that's a broad enough agenda and vague enough agenda to encompass either a relatively gradual, partial, and slow return to a policy of engagement or a fast-paced and forward-leaning one. As John mentioned at the outset, some of the advisors to the campaign and some outside observers have said not to expect Cuba to be a priority because there's just so many other major issues that the administration will have to face. And also that things have changed on the ground in Cuba, in the relationship with Venezuela, so that we can't just expect a return to the Obama policy. Obviously, the surge in Cuban American support for Trump will give ammunition to those who want to argue that Cuba is too dangerous politically for Democrats to risk doing more than just the minimum. I think there's good counter arguments to that. I don't think Biden lost South Florida because of his Cuba policy or his Venezuela policy, for that matter. But happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if people are interested. But I do think it will take some pushing from outside constituencies to get the administration to act on the promises that it's made sooner rather than later. I'm sure there will be people in the administration because so far it's a pretty broad tent. I'm sure there'll be people there who want to move quickly on Cuba, but I'm also pretty sure there's going to be people in the administration who want to move more slowly. And so I think people who have supported the Biden campaign, people who are generally supportive of Biden's policy toward Cuba ought to be very active and very articulate that it's the people who support engagement to Cuba that voted for Biden-Harris, and it's the people who opposed engagement with Cuba who voted for the other guy. Now, normally you wouldn't expect that an issue like Cuba would be high on the agenda, but I do think that we can expect the administration to have to pay some attention to the issue early on. And that's because the 9th Summit of the Americas is scheduled with the United States as host, scheduled for sometime in fall 2021. And that's a kind of a decision-forcing event, as we say in Washington. It's going to really force the administration to figure out what its Latin America policy is and what its Cuba policy is in advance of that summit. So we may see some results faster than we might otherwise expect. So let me say in summary, I'm optimistic, but this is a change in policy that won't just happen all by itself. We can't just sit back and wait for the new administration to take the initiative on its own. They need to be pushed, they need to be encouraged, they need to be supported when they do the right thing. And as I say, we need to remind them that the people who support engagement voted for them. Thanks.
Okay, Bill, could you just tell people what that Conference of the Americas is and give a 2-minute history of Cuba's entry into it, just so people.
Sure. So the Summit of the Americas was actually, it's a summit of the heads of state in the Western Hemisphere. So it's all of Latin America, the United States, and Canada. It meets every 3 years. It was started by the Clinton administration, and the first summit was, if I remember correctly, 1994, and it was in the United States. That's the only one since that was held in the United States. So this will be only the second coming up this year. Cuba was banned from the conference from the summit for many years because it was supposedly a summit of democratic countries. Now, not every country that was coming to the summit was a model of democracy, but we singled out the Cubans, and so they were not invited. Eventually, the Latin American heads of state tired of this policy, and they told Obama in the second to the last summit that happened under his presidency that they wouldn't come if the Cubans were not invited. And so, in fact, in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath of the announcement of normalization of relations, Cuba was invited and did attend the summit in 2015. And there was a private meeting between Obama and Raul Castro, and the whole process was very positive. There was tremendous support across Latin America. Then, of course, in the summit after that, which took place under Donald Trump, the Cubans were invited, but they sent the foreign minister rather than Raul Castro. And Trump, of course, did not attend. He sent Vice President Pence instead. And there was a pretty nasty exchange between Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez and the Vice President. So that was not a particularly helpful thing.
All right, but particularly this time with it being in the US, as you said, it does offer. So Tom is not on. So let me just say that what we have asked him to do is to reflect on the transition from the early days of licensing, highly politicized, highly bureaucratic, and expensive process. That specific licenses that groups had to use, which continued even into the beginning of the Obama administration. And then it became general licenses and things changed dramatically. I don't know, Collin can fill in probably some of what Tom would have said, and he may still join us, but did you start when it was still specific licensing, or had you come on?
I did. I got a specific license from the Obama Treasury, and then I actually renewed that, which both the application process and you'll recall the renewal process was almost even worse, because you had to document in detail down to the minutes and seconds of what each traveler was doing in Cuba. Not only what they were doing, but then also explaining why it was beneficial to both them and the Cubans they were involved in. I don't remember the specific page number, but I think my application for renewal was somewhere around 25,000 pages, because I had taken hundreds of groups, which was thousands of travelers.
Yeah.
So as you know, probably not the best use, not only of my time, but of government bureaucrats that could be potentially investigating Al-Qaeda or, drug trafficking or other money flows that probably represent larger risk and strategic interest to the United States.
Right. Yeah, I remember that when we got our license, it took us 6 times at applying for it. And I think what finally happened was when Senator Leahy met with OFAC, and they blew out all of the reporting requirements, and also our license got approved. So that was in the difficult first term of Obama, when he had opened things up for Cuban Americans, but it still was not open for the rest of us. So Collin, why don't you go on from there and talk about the kinds of travel that you've been involved in, and where you think that's heading under Biden.
Terrific. Well, thank you, John, for organizing, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. And always a challenge and a privilege to follow Bill LeoGrande, somebody who I think all of us Cuba watchers really appreciate and admire. There's also a little bit of overlap. I'm happy to talk about the travel I've been involved in, but I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about what I think we can hope for, expect, and push for from a Biden administration, and giving a little bit of context on that. Some of this stuff Bill mentioned, so sorry for repeating, but hopefully it's a reinforcing mechanism so that we all get on board for it. So I think the first thing, and perhaps most important, would be a return to a general license for 3 categories that were either eliminated, which was the case of people to people, which is eliminated altogether, and then switched from a general to a specific license for public performances and professional research or professional meetings. And I think that this is important, for a number of reasons, but mainly one, without those categories being restored, particularly people to people, we'll see some limited small scale travel in the support for the Cuban people category, religious travel, and others, educational, which has become more difficult, but there's still some opportunities. But I think in order to get the tour operators re-engaged, to get the booking sites, to get individual travelers, and kind of really just get real movement from the travel industry, we need a return to those categories. So I think that's one of the main things that we should be pushing for. And I agree with Bill that there's this debate about whether this is done early on in one kind of stroke of the pen or this is gradual. And I'd argue both for the travel industry and then within a policy of engagement in general, we really need this stuff to happen early on, because otherwise it's a policy without legs. A lot of the energy, the positive results, and really reinforcing and selling the policy both to Americans and Cubans, and then having people that benefit, was really through the travel aspect when you look at the interesting years during the Obama administration. And so while limited steps to help, the suffering in terms of family divides and Cuban American issues is important, I think in terms of kind of massively affecting and benefiting folks, I think the travel component is so important. So I think it's important that that happens early on, along with the other steps that I'll mention. I think it's important to remove all restrictions on lodging. As Bill mentioned, there's a really growing community of entrepreneurs that have started not only just renting rooms, but almost, small boutique hotels that can sometimes be up to 10 or 15 rooms, which is wonderful in terms of the experience and the quality. I highly recommend it. At the same time, there's certain events when you look at, as I mentioned on the first point, really incorporating the travel industry, something that we saw during the latter years of the Obama administration, corporate retreats, conferences. You had, massive events that got a lot of people down and represented serious income for players in the travel industry. And those are the types of things that require, not only the lodging at the hotel, but many times the facilities, the conference rooms, et cetera. So I think that that's a very important step. One thing to note there, there will be a messaging challenge on that. One of the really effective things that the Trump administration has done, has been messaging about punishing the Cuban military and the Cuban elites. And so, whether you believe that's the right thing to do, or you believe that it's actually working, it's a message that does sell with certain constituencies, and it is hard politically to argue against. So I think there'll be a question there for the Biden administration. Do they remove all restrictions on lodging, or do they potentially, which I advocate for, but do they potentially kind of go back to some of the Trump stuff that limits some of the hotels that have clear links to the military, but liberalizing lodging at the others? And just one other point on that, where, I'm a strong advocate for supporting Cuban entrepreneurs in the private sector. And, part of Obama's policy was to support the private sector, a growing middle class. And I think that's principled, and I think it's the right thing to do. I also think that a lot of times, the average Cuban that's not an entrepreneur can get lost in the messaging and in the policy. There's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Cubans that work directly or indirectly in the tourism sector that aren't entrepreneurs, which would be 500,000 or so. And these are people that, they might officially work for the state with a low state salary, but tips and other kind of movement with foreigners really changes their well-being. And so this notion of, we can only support the private sector, and there's not an effort of our policy, and particularly travel, to also support, others, because there's a lot of good people that aren't entrepreneurs that also benefit from travel. So I think that's important, both particularly with the lodging, but just more broadly with policy. Another thing Bill mentioned, which I think is important, is removing all the restrictions on air and sea travel. So we saw the Trump administration restrict, I'm going to run out of time. John, do I get any extra minutes because Tom didn't show up? So the Trump administration restricted flights to only Havana, which affects the broader travel industry, and particularly Cuban Americans, who now are stuck with a much higher bill and a logistical headache to get to other areas of the island. So I'd like to see a return to that. There's also private flights. There's yachts or sailboats, sea travel in general, which of course brings up the issue of cruise ships. And I think the best thing for the Biden administration is to remove all of those restrictions. If somebody wants to fly down on a private jet, or they want to go on a cruise, or any of those things, that should happen. So I hope that we'll see that. I saw a reference to this in the Q&A or in the chat. I think it would be important, whether it's a public statement and or a private communication, to the bureaucracy, particularly the Treasury Department, that investigating Cuba travel is not a priority. It's not a good use of resources. And you might recall early on in the Obama administration, before he actually made significant changes, he did publicly say that he had directed members of his, or at different agencies, not to waste their time investigating Cuba travel. And I think that's important. And I alluded to it in the question in the opening about licensing. I mean, there's really troubling experiences in the past, like 9/11, when we had more people at the Treasury Department working on, figuring out if somebody's bringing, rum and cigars back from Cuba, or spending too much time at the beach, rather than investigating really serious issues that concern U.S. national security. So I hope that'll happen. One final thing that I'll mention on steps that I think are important for travel is a bilateral dialogue. There's a possibility that the Biden administration just makes changes to liberalize travel and doesn't start to sit down and talk with the Cubans, or that comes later. And, if that happens, it happens. But I think there's a strong argument that if you're going to have hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of Americans traveling to Cuba, you need a bilateral dialogue. You need civil aviation meeting. You need, different experts and different systems. And so there has to be communication. And, that gets to the issue. There's obviously a troubling challenge with these health incidents at the U.S. Embassy. I think there's an immediate need to figure out a resolution to that for consular services. But then also when we look at travel, and I can talk later about stories of Americans who got COVID, or Americans that have had legal issues and things like that, which are quite minimal because for whatever reason, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of issues that have presented in terms of American health and safety on the island. But it is important to have a fully functioning embassy. So quickly, as my time wraps up, just some of the benefits of this policy, which hopefully many of us on the call share them, but I think it's worth reiterating them. Number one would be restoring Americans' rights to travel freely. We kind of take for granted how long we've had this crazy policy, but I think it's ridiculous that Cuba is the one country that's restricted when you look at human rights issues, safety issues, and other things across the globe. And, in a talk with Congressman Jim McGovern recently, he said it best. He said, this policy is an embarrassment to not only U.S. foreign policy, but to domestic politics. And so I think part of it is just restoring Americans' rights to travel. We saw during the limited time, right? We've had 60 years of a failed policy of restrictions, and we had like a 2-year boom when Obama actually started to open it up. And it was incredibly beneficial for a number of people, one being the US travel industry. And you have to recall that Cuba was Airbnb's fastest growing market in the history of the company anywhere in the world. Right. And you had, despite all of the challenges with OFAC and other things, Starwood, the cruises, the airlines, booking sites, tour operators, you even look at US food sales, which was somewhat connected. And so the US travel industry and US business benefited during the last opening and is sure to benefit long term. So I think there's a strong argument there. And then, it's good for civil society in both countries. And I wouldn't limit it. We focus, again, a lot on the Cuban people, and it certainly is beneficial to the Cuban people. But I think there's also a tremendous amount of benefits for, civil society in America. Think about not only the American Little League teams that have gone down to play in Cuba, but, maybe it's a family that travels and they meet, their host family in Cuba, and then they invite them up, or the dance group from Cuba, or the others that, come to the US. And these are strong connections through culture. They make America a richer place. They make America a better place. And, not only is it benefiting the Cubans, but it's two-way. I think America's better when we have Cuban artists that are coming here, Cuban dance groups and things like that. And then, my final point, there's a lot of chatter right now about how to interpret the elections in South Florida. There's also a push from artists in Cuba that, there's some tension and complaints of heavy-handed tactics from the Cuban government, and kind of this analysis of, how will that affect the Biden policy? And there's this concerning messaging that, again, goes back 60 years that's very focused on how do we punish the Cuban government, or how do we strangle the Cuban government into changing their behavior. And, I think a lot of times the Cuban people get lost and, look at, Bill mentioned this in his opening, Cubans were celebrating Biden's victory. And I don't think it's because they're inspired by his healthcare plan in the US, or that they see him as a innovative, moving speaker. I think it's because they see their well-being directly linked to a better relationship between the US and Cuba. It's an incredibly tough time in Cuba with COVID and a slowdown in tourism. There's currency unification coming up that's going to have a very serious impact on the economic situation, et cetera. And so I do think if you're looking to do the right thing and help the Cuban people, 99% of Cubans that live on the island were better off from a policy of engagement and will benefit from restored engagement under the Biden administration. So I'll stop
Great.
there.
Thank you. Let me just add one footnote as to the reason that we hope the Biden's people will move quickly on this issue, and that is planning time. Whether it's Collin organizing big business groups or university groups, or others that are in the commercial sector in the US, you need months and months and months. And so that means that the announcement in February means that people could think seriously about summer when COVID is hopefully controlled, but certainly they could be planning for the fall. If the decision is delayed until sometime in the spring, then it puts a great stress on the universities and commercial sector trying to organize for the following year, the following fall. And Bill, the other point that occurred to me on the diplomatic side is, or the political side, is that the Georgia election is very important. If the Democrats control the Senate, then we presumably will be able to have a full ambassador in Havana. If the Republicans control it, we'll be stuck as we were with a lower level diplomatic status. And also all kinds of other options open up, including trying to control USAID's proclivities. I think we need to remember that one of the reasons that the first term of Obama went so slowly was the Alan Gross, Cuban 5, Hillary Clinton dilemma, that the issue became a real logjam on everything. And that's not to say that people aren't going to try and create a similar issue in the first months of the Biden administration. So the sooner the decisions are made and acted on, the better it will be to avoid any of the imposed obstacles. So Rita, you're the new kid on the block, relatively speaking, and it's a slightly different block. So Rita's organization is like a Cuban. Collin's is Cuban Educational Travel. If you go into their bios on the info page, you'll see their links and you can contact them directly. Rita.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, John. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I have a bit of an echo on my end. Just kind of to add to Collin's, one of Collin's points, living here through the Obama administration and now, you know, through the Trump, all Trump's changes and his policies with Cuba has really, being on the ground here has allowed me to see the direct impact that both administrations have had in Cuba. And to give you just a small story about one of my dear friends here, when I came in 2015 for the first time, he picked me up in a taxi, and his dream was to have a small business, but he was, you know, making a few dollars, driving a taxi a few hours a day. And the following year, that was in 2015, the following year, he bought a printer, and he opened a small printing business basically out of his house. As we went into the later Obama years, his business with one printer turned into a huge office with enormous machines, where he really focused on his digital design business, and he had 10 people working under him, and that happened in just 3.5 years. So as we got into 2019 with Trump, and tourism slowed down, just to see how people who really weren't directly working in tourism, he had to drop his 10 employees to half. So he now had 5 employees. And now he's basically, with COVID and everything that's happened this past year during the pandemic, he's down to himself and his wife once more. So really, you can see in just that short little story about Fidel, whose name is actually Fidel Castro. It's kind of, I always like to tell people that when I arrived in Havana, Fidel Castro picked me up in a 1956 Chevy Bel Air. And it really, it's a nice little anecdote. But you can kind of see, just with that short story about Fidel, that, you know, there has been such an impact to the average Cuban. And so those 10 people are not entrepreneurs, but they are working in the private sector, not directly with tourism, but have been seriously impacted in the last 2 years by the drop in tourism and then the pandemic. One category, the only category of travel that really is open to the majority of us right now, is support for the Cuban people. Those are the trips that I have been doing for the past 4.5, 5 years. They're intensive, immersive experiences with locals, really fun, interesting trips with quite an intense cultural exchange. To travel legally under that category, you have to use Casa Particulares, as opposed to hotels. You have to, you know, go to private restaurants and really kind of avoid the government owned and operated facilities. And you really have to put your money directly into the hands of the Cuban people. So that is a category that is still in effect, has not been affected by the Trump policy changes. And we are hoping, as the pandemic starts to ease off and the vaccine becomes available, that will pick up again at the beginning of the coming year. So for all the travel providers on the call here, you can still send your clients to Cuba under that category. It is something that you can do as an individual, although it can be a little bit difficult and tricky. You have to have a full-time schedule of activities, one-on-one with locals, but you can easily do it with the help of a Cuban-based travel provider. And that's if anyone has any questions about that later on.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm gonna ask our co-sponsor to introduce himself and his organization. And while that's happening, if panelists can take a look at the questions and pick out questions that you'd like to answer. We'll try to do it that way. I have a few that came separately that I'll add in, and I've caught a couple of factual questions that I want to respond to. But Greg, why don't you let us know about CREST and its relationship to Cuba?
Terrific. Thanks, John, and all panelists. This has been very exciting. We're the Center for Responsible Travel. We're a nonprofit here based in the U.S. Have been working for a number of years, since 2016, in Cuba. In fact, we're one of the few U.S.-based NGOs that continues throughout the Trump administration to be able to conduct research and some field work. We're a nonprofit research and advocacy organization. We're really, our work in Cuba is really focused around educational and people-to-people exchanges. We're really emphasizing cross-cultural understanding and how this can be transformative both between Cubans, Cuban Americans who travel, and American travelers themselves. So we're very proud to co-sponsor this exciting and certainly very timely webinar. Just briefly, while our panelists are getting their questions kind of lined up, our work continues to focus in Cuba around three areas. One is we work to strengthen small-scale household-based tourism on the islands. We're very cognizant of the restrictions, and we're focusing very much on casas particulares and on that kind of research and implications or activation. The second is we're very much, and this is going to be, I think, very important with the new Biden administration, we are working and have been working on ways to mitigate the impacts of climate change on the tourism sector, specifically the small-scale household-based tourism in Cuba. And then third, we've been consistently advocating for legal U.S. travel to the island. Now, our initiatives around small-scale tourism in Cuba and how we advocate for travel have been focused around, first was focused around cruise tourism, but then we shifted and I've put our attention, and we've been sponsoring sustainable tourism conferences up until COVID at universities, both in the provinces of Holguín and Pinar del Rio. And we've been bringing international tourism experts and exchanges to ensure that these small-scale tourism efforts are still getting that state-of-the-art technical exchange, et cetera. And then also right now, we have been spending the last year focusing and conducting critical research surrounding the impacts both of the COVID pandemic and climate change on Cuba's small-scale tourism sector. So we're going to be watching with great interest, and we'll be attempting to influence the Biden administration as well on that, ensuring that climate change is an important element to the opening of tourism. And finally, then, our advocacy work has continued and focused on results related to engaging critically needed policy advocacy in the U.S. around U.S. travel policies. We've been coordinating a small advocacy group. We've been working with this group, of course, in the U.S. centered around U.S. travel policies. And we're looking to see how we can help direct and influence from our perspective, the Biden administration as we open up the opportunities here. And so this participation with the panel and with the nearly 300 participants we've had at a particular period of time now has been very, very productive. So thank you, John, and all the panelists, and we really appreciate the opportunity. And John, let's get to some of those questions now.
Thanks. Two quick ones. I noticed Ramon asked two questions. One was about remittances. Just before the election, effectively, the Trump administration said that it was going to shut down anybody that was doing remittances through a Cuban Army-linked bank, and that included Western Union. So that was the end of the game. Now the Cubans have suggested, and Collin may have additional information on it, but I think the Cubans are looking at a civilian bank that could be the intermediary. So I don't know what the latest on that is, but Trump did try to, or the people who are making the words for Trump did try to cut off all remittances regardless of the amount. On the hotels, you're right. There were a set of hotels that even under Obama were precluded, which were the Gaviota hotels. Gaviota is most directly a military related company, but almost all those hotels were in resort areas, which in principle Americans couldn't go to anyway because it didn't meet the qualifications of the travel licensing. Somebody else asked the question of whether Biden might come up with a new category that would not be as restrictive as even people to people or support for the Cuban people, which is basically to say a category that would allow you to just go on your own decision about it. That, I'm afraid, I'm not a lawyer, and Collin may have some additional, or Rita may have additional on this, but my understanding is the way around the embargo are these categories that were put into the law. And you can sort of play around with the definition of categories, but you can't just throw them out or write a whole new one without repealing the law, which is where you get to the question of the McGovern or Leahy bills, which are to end all travel restrictions. If those were passed, then all of the resort hotels, the all-inclusive real holiday vacations would become open to individual travelers and to American travel agents and tour operators, but that would take legislation. And that's a second stage, and also dependent on probably on what happens in Georgia. Anybody want to pick out questions and respond to them? Bill, Collin, Rita, have you found something that, Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I said there's a bunch of them, obviously. So one was about the currency reunification and how that's going. And they're going to start it on January 1st. They've been preparing for it literally for years and years. And for those of you who may not be aware, this is unifying the Cuban national peso with we're actually getting rid of the convertible peso, which for years was pegged at 1 to the dollar. And the new exchange rate will be 24 Cuban pesos to the dollar. This is going to cause some real problems because they had dual exchange rates. They had in the consumer sector a 24-to-1 exchange rate, but in the enterprise sector, they were actually exchanging 1 Cuban peso for $1, which really made no sense. It created an incentive for people who are importing things to make excess profit, and it created a disincentive for exporters. So they're going to get rid of that, but what it means is that now imports, the price of imports is going to go up, because the importing companies won't be able to make those excess profits anymore. So to stay solvent, they're going to have to raise the prices of the imported goods that they sell to consumers. To offset those increases, the government has said it's going to increase salaries by 500%. But even that may not be enough to actually cover some of the increases in the cost of consumer goods that people are going to see. So this is, very much uncertain in terms of the impact that it's going to have, because you're putting a lot more of the consumer economy subject to market prices. And we'll just have to see how it works out. They're doing this with no safety net. They don't have much in the way of foreign exchange earning reserves, largely because of the Trump sanctions and the closure of the tourist sector. And they don't have access to what most countries would have, which is help from international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. So it's really a high wire act that the government is undertaking, and they're doing it because they recognize that the distortions introduced in the economy because of this dual currency and dual exchange rate was really constraining growth. And so they know they have to do it. And we'll see what happens after the 1st of January. I would just want to say that the point about disability that somebody made in the chat and how closing the hotels to American visitors discriminates against people with disabilities, I think that's a great point. And I'm going to, I would pass that along whenever I can to people, and everybody else should as well, because, that's something that's a really good argument against retaining that kind of restriction. Someone asked about whether tourism really helps ordinary Cubans, since the government gets a lot of those resources, even especially if people are staying in government-owned hotels and so on. And I would say it does. It does because of tips, because of people hiring private tourist guides, because of people eating in private restaurants, because of people staying in private homes. And there's also, as Collin mentioned, there's all the multiplier effect of the people who work in a state-owned hotel wages and the fact that they're employed as a result of the tourist sector. There's a great economic analysis of tourism on the Brookings Institution website, written by Richard Newfarmer and Richard Feinberg. If people want to really do a deep dive into the economics of the Cuban tourist sector and the multiplier effects it has through the whole economy, I recommend it.
Collin or Rita, have you picked out something that you'd like to respond to?
Sure. I made a little list. Let's see where to start.
Collin, can you change your lighting a little bit? We can hardly see you. That's you're very dark at this point. So
sorry, it got dark during this call.
Okay.
Why doesn't Rita go and let me find a lamp or something?
Okay. Rita, do you have something you want to respond to from the list?
I had been looking at the same question that Bill just responded to about how it really trickles down to how the dollars that go into tourism really trickle down on every level. Even yesterday, I landed into Havana last night at around 9 p.m. And I know that the people who work in the airport and help you with your luggage and whatnot, they all work for the state agencies. But they're living off all the tips from the tourists. And they were so excited to hear that there was another, a flight coming in from Iberia. There were 400 people coming from Spain, and it was, they were all talking amongst themselves that finally there were people arriving, that maybe they'd be able to have a good end of the year. They were gonna use some of the money to celebrate the fin de año. Which is such a big celebration here in Cuba. So the dollars do trickle down on a very local level, even if you're not in tourism.
There are several questions about how COVID is being handled now. So you might talk about what happened to you when you came back to Cuba yesterday and how this will all change over the next few months, but at least what's happening now, and Collin may have some additional to that.
So I really feel that the Cuban government has put some excellent measures in place for tourists arriving during the pandemic. I arrived last night. Within 10 minutes, I had my PCR done. My daughter had her PCR done. It was all very, very well organized. Everyone who's entering the country will now receive a PCR test at the airport before you even go through customs. Once you will receive the results in 24 to 48 hours. It's most likely going to be closer to 48 hours, as I've heard from several people who came in the last couple of weeks. And you get to go home, you get to go, for the tourists, they can go to their casa particular, they can go to their hotel if they're staying in one. And then once you do receive a negative PCR, you are free to travel as as you normally would with your group, or whether it's in support for the Cuban people or whatever other legal category you are arriving under. And you will be followed by a nurse or a doctor, a community nurse or doctor. Today at 12 p.m., I received a call from our local nurse. She came to the house, she took my temperature, she took my daughter's temperature, she checked in with us. She said she would be back again tomorrow afternoon, and that hopefully by then we would have the results to the test. So they are being very strict, and really, I feel that they've put some very good methods in place for protecting the local community as well as tourists while traveling here.
Thank you. So Collin, we can see you a bit better if you want to go to your list now. You're still a little in the shade, but at least we can see your features.
You got me at dusk. I apologize. So just a few of the things that I saw in the chat that I can touch on. One, there was a question about whether we should be pushing for an end for all restrictions. And I think certainly, I think probably most people on this call favor completely lifting the embargo, which would entail all restrictions and specifically ending all restrictions on travel. There is some legislation in the House and Senate, McGovern and Leahy, and I think the travel industry should stick behind that, and we should continue to advocate for that. I think being realistic in terms of what the situation in Congress is, and then also timing. I do think the first step and the most important step is to push the Biden administration to use its executive authority to make as many changes as legally possible. So that's just a comment on that. One clarification, I think in the chat, and then I think someone mentioned that there was restrictions on hotels during the Obama administration, but the restricted list was actually announced and put in place in June of 2017. That was part of the first series of changes by the Trump administration. And I already addressed that in my talk, whether the Biden administration will recede that list altogether or they'll recede the more recent one, which happened just months ago, that put all hotels, not just military linked hotels. So I think we'll have to wait and see. There was a question in there about statistics on Airbnb. I mentioned in my presentation that Cuba was the fastest growing market, proportionally for Airbnb. I don't have that in front of me, but I'd encourage, if you do a search, there's some fact sheets that they put together for the White House. And actually, when President Obama came to Cuba, one of the events that they organized was an event with Cuban and American entrepreneurs, and the team from Airbnb was present at that. And I think Airbnb became a very solid example of what's possible through a policy of engagement in terms of supporting U.S. business, but then also supporting the Cuban people. And so I'd encourage you to look at that fact sheet, because it talks about the amount of money that goes directly into the hands of Cubans, the very little amount of taxes that were paid on either end, and makes the case for how impactful that was. Two other things on finances, and I agree with everything Bill said on the currency unification and what that means for inflation, and the fact that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. I think one of the reasons why the Cuban government has dragged its feet on this, after nearly, at least a half, if not a decade of saying that they need to do it as the single most important reform to get the economy on track, is because nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen, what the exact impact is going to be. I think that's important to keep in mind. There was a specific question to what does this mean for people that bring dollars and for the tourism sector? I think in the short term, the dollar over the last year, as Cuba's introduced dollar stores and there's been hints that they were moving towards currency reform, the dollar at official exchange rate has remained the same. On the black market, it's about as coveted as anything you could imagine. So if anything, I think dollars will continue to be highly sought. So it's certainly going to be, something that's going to go far. while you're here. I also think, and this kind of gets to the COVID question, which I think John and Rita both did a good job of addressing. But if you look at timing, I think we're looking, you'll see some small individual and small group travel in the coming months because Cuba has done such a good job with COVID. But realistically, until we have a vaccine and there's some sense of normalcy in the US and other markets, I think we're 6 months away at least, if not 8 or 9 months from an uptick in travel. And, that gives some time to the Biden administration. I agree with you, John. I hope it's early so that planning could take place. But the other thing related to currency reform, I think the really intense 6 months of the currency reform will be from, day one in January through the spring, summer. And so potentially there'll be some normalization, assuming it goes well, before there's major US travel. We'll have a better sense of what's happening with the economy and what the currency reform means. And then just the last point, somebody asked about credit cards. Are we close to credit cards working? I would say no, we're nowhere close, unfortunately. But I think that brings us to another point. I mentioned it's really important, beyond the specific travel measures, that the Biden administration look into other things and open up a bilateral dialogue. And I think veterans in the travel industry or anyone that's had commercial relations with Cuba over the years knows that the most, sensitive part of the infrastructure is the payment system. And with 4 years of Trump sanctions, it's become particularly vulnerable to the point where there's been instances where it's been very, very difficult to make payments for everyone, for the travel operators, for the airlines, for the cruise ships and others. And the Trump sanctions have really strategically attacked that payment infrastructure, and it's in a very vulnerable spot. And so I think that, these travel measures to liberate travel to Cuba will hopefully, and we should be pushing the Biden administration to also aggressively work on dealing with some of the restrictions on the, financial services, and hopefully work with some of these banks that have actively worked on Cuba over the years to figure out what assurances they need for themselves and for intermediary banks so that we can make sure that there's a payment structure, because nobody's going to travel if there's not a way to pay people on the other side.
Bill, do you see anything else you want to address from the list?
There is a question there about the voting in South Florida. So let me say a little bit about that. It's clear that Trump increased his share of the Cuban American vote over what he got in 2016. But it's not at all clear that he did that vote changed because of Biden's policy on Cuba specifically. It was Cuban Americans, Venezuelan Americans, Colombian Americans that were sort of the core of this boost that Trump got in Miami-Dade. And it's because the Trump campaign attacked Biden and Democrats generally as being socialists. And so the argument was not one about foreign policy. It was about what a Democratic Party, a socialist Democratic Party would do to destroy the economy of the United States, just like the socialists destroyed the economy in Venezuela and destroyed the economy in Cuba. And so it was really a domestic political appeal that was being made with enormous disinformation and all kinds of lies, essentially. But that was what did the trick for them. The other problem was that the Democratic campaign generally thought that this accusation was so ridiculous that it didn't need to be responded to. And the result is that by the time they realized it was really getting traction, it was too late to really mount a serious response. The third thing is that the campaign's infrastructure in Florida was not very strong. They didn't have a campaign director for the state of Florida, if you can believe it, until September. And I think in retrospect, it shows that they put all their chips on rebuilding the blue wall in the Midwest. And since it worked, I can't really criticize it.
If you look at the FIU poll that has come out every year, what is fascinating is that although the majority of Cuban Americans have become in some ways more conservative on questions like the embargo or who they were going to support, their position on the issue of remittances, on the issue of flights to regional cities, on the things that directly affected them were like 60% plus against Trump. Now, in the best of all possible worlds, the Biden people would have jumped on those contradictions and made a major campaign about it. Instead, the only thing I think they did was at the last minute, when this story leaked that all remittances were going to be shut down, they issued a statement from one of their campaign people that showed up on Cuba, but I don't think it had any other impact. And so they just really, unlike Obama, who had seriously campaigned with Cuban Americans. So I think in part it's the priority politics that Bill talked about. But as somebody said earlier, the fact that the Democrats didn't win Florida means that they owe nothing to the votes of Florida. Somebody asked, several people have asked about timing, whether there's any indication of the second and third level people in the State Department, whether there's any indication of how quickly the consular authority will be accessible again. Bill, do you have any thoughts on that? And I'm going to mute because of the.
Yeah, no, I mean, we don't know who's going to be at those second and third level of officials. I mean, he's still appointing his cabinet after all, right? And so until they get done with that, now there are people who, worked on the campaign on Latin America. There are people on the transition team for the State Department who have a history of working on Latin American issues. Some of those people, are likely to end up in positions of authority, but until we know exactly who they are, it's going to be hard to predict sort of what the internal balance is between people who want to go fast and people who would prefer to go slow. And as I say, that's why I think it's really important that outside constituencies that are sort of the natural allies of a Biden-Harris administration make their preferences known about going faster rather than going slower.
Several people have asked about wanting to send help to friends, family. Collin or Rita, do you know, have any of the package services started up again? I noticed the Cubans are allowing in package services, but I don't know if that means that any of them from the US side have opened.
I know there are several.
Go ahead.
Okay. There are several that are working right now. Maybe Collin, you have some of the names of them. I know there are delays of like 2 to 3 months on arrival, or have been up until this point. But maybe you know some of the names, Collin.
I don't, and I'm a bad friend because I'm friends with some of them, but they're keeping me. But I don't remember on timing, but I do know, it's not something that only happened in the last, weeks or months, that there's been some services that have been ongoing almost throughout the pandemic. So I don't know, maybe we can follow up, but I think there are options. They're obviously limited. And as we've discussed, the strategic attack by the Trump administration on remittances is really troubling, because the natural way to do this for many people would be to go to Western Union right now and send a remittance via Western Union. And that unfortunately is not working, and hopefully will be a very serious priority of the incoming administration to get that resolved quickly.
Is there any indication on when the new currency or the CUP is the currency, whether dollars will still be freely tradable, payable to stores and such, or is it, will it go back to the CUC model?
Now they've opened these hard currency stores, right? The convertible currency stores, where if you have dollars, you basically get a debit card, and you can spend those dollars at these stores that only take the convertible currency debit cards. But one of the questions in the chat was, when is the CUC going to become worthless? And I don't actually know the answer to that. I know that the transition is supposed to happen in beginning on January 1. And the government has said that people who have bank accounts with CUC will be held harmless. But if you're like me and you've got a few CUC that you like to have so that you don't have to change money at the airport, I'm not sure when those become worthless, but maybe Rita or Collin will know the answer to that.
Yeah, the truth is, I dedicated most of my headspace to travel today, and the currency unification would have taken up 3/4 of my brain. But I do think on that, it's an ongoing debate. And, as people that are familiar with how rollouts of policies happen in Cuba, there'll be a document that's printed. Usually it's announced on the television, and then there's a whole series of mesa redondas where they'll have ministers and vice ministers come on and go through these discussions. And, that's something that's happened over the last, gosh, I forget when Diaz-Canel made the short announcement on the news last week at some point. I think it was last Thursday. So just a week ago today. And I expect some of this to change. They announced something that was really controversial, which is I also think symbolic of kind of changing times in Cuba. But as they got into a discussion of the currency and specifically on the price of electricity and how much, electricity is going to cost going forward within the context of this currency unification and the price for very simple things, Cubans started to use the example of how much it would cost to have just one air conditioning unit running. And it was very high and cost prohibitive to the majority of Cubans, very controversial. And the government kind of quickly retreated a bit and said that they're analyzing it. And so I think that's a good example of what we can potentially expect with this currency unification. There's going to be a lot of road bumps. There's going to be a lot of pain, and potentially some of this stuff is going to change. Maybe when they hear Bill LeoGrande has 200 kooks left, they're going to postpone the process of devaluing that. Maybe that's not the best example, but that information might be out there and I might not have it on the tip of my head. But I think a lot of this stuff is fluid.
There was a story that said through the end of I forget, it was the beginning of June or the end of June, that you can still exchange CUC.
That's what I've been hearing as well.
Yeah. I have incidentally, as you've seen, for the first time in one of these, I'm trying out the poll function, which I hope is not disruptive, but you should send me a note if it has been disruptive. But it's a real-time way of getting a sense from people. We are down to about 207 people, so we've lost about 60 or 70 people in the course of the program. So I want to try to wrap it up in maybe 10 minutes if there are questions that any of you have seen that ought to be looked at. One that I noted was about the sonic attacks, or there's now a different word being used by the National Academy of Sciences. The Cubans, and if you go to our page where the bios are and the email addresses for Rita and Collin are found, so the people who've been asking for them, that's where you can find them. Also on that page now is the link to the policy paper that Bill talked about, and also an article that Bill wrote in the Sun Sentinel about conditionality, which is very useful, and also an article that was in Reuters of the Cuban medical people or scientific people responding to the National Academy of Sciences. And you need to look at that story, because essentially what the Cuban scientists are saying, no, that's not the explanation. For the first time that I'm aware of in a long time, they're accepting the premise that there was a problem. They're just saying that the National Academy of Sciences has not identified what the source of the problem was. And I think if you look on our blog, you'll see there's a page that goes to the results from the Canadian research, which point to chemical neurotoxins, which can do all of the same things that the various science fiction models can do in terms of people's hearing and balance and brain conditions. So I think the story is by no means finished, but hopefully both sides will recognize that it has to be answered and it has to be dealt with in terms of who was responsible for it. Whether it's dealt with publicly or privately isn't important, but President Biden is not going to reopen the embassy if a month later the same problem happens again.
John,
go ahead.
John, I'm going to respectfully disagree with you here.
Okay, go ahead, fine.
I don't think that we should make reopening the embassy conditional on solving this mystery, because I don't think it's ever going to be solved definitively. I think what has to be done is you have to put in place a series of measures to safeguard U.S. diplomats as much as you possibly can with baseline testing and regular testing while they're there, and additional security measures and a whole range of things that could be worked out with the Cuban government. But I think it would be a terrible mistake to say, well, we can't restaff the embassy until we know what happened and who was responsible, because I literally don't think we ever will.
That we'll see, but my view is that how quickly they move on the embassy depends on the assurances that they have. So whether that's an explanation or an assurance from the Cuban side, I don't know. But that's one of the things in play, certainly. And I think the Cuban language is very interesting at this point. So Al Fox suggested that we should all push to get the President Biden to immediately issue on January 21st an executive order. So Bill, Collin, Rita, do you have some feelings about, or Greg, you certainly have as legitimate a voice in any of this discussion at this point. Should that become a tactical focus that we should start making a demand the way other interest groups are making demands?
Well, you know, they're putting together a list of executive orders to reverse a lot of the bad things that Trump did in a whole range of policy areas. So I think if one of them was to return the CACR to where they were before Trump came in, I think that would be a great one to put in the queue.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well, Bill. That's a good assessment of that.
I noticed that Steve Wilkinson makes the presumption that the president has the constitutional power to unilaterally lift the embargo. That's news to me. Bill, do you have any sense that he could do that?
So Bob Muse attorney Bob Muse, who follows Cuba very closely, has been making this argument for a number of years. He's just published a brand new article, which I think is linked in the chat, in which he goes through in considerable detail the legal argument for this presumed authority for the president to basically declare Helms-Burton unconstitutional and just lift the embargo. It's a persuasive legal argument, but I think the problem is, as Steve himself points out in the chat, is that it's not strictly a legal question. It's a political question. And every president since Helms-Burton went into effect has accepted the idea that, in fact, it's binding and that you can't lift the embargo in its entirety without congressional action. So I think the problem is a political problem more than it is a legal one. And if you have a president who's got the political will to really try to end the embargo, there's an enormous amount that can be done, more than what Obama did, to punch enormous holes in the embargo by using the licensing authority. And so, my recommendation would be use the licensing authority to its maximum in making as many exceptions to the embargo as broadly as you can and as you're willing to do. And let's leave worrying about sort of the legal question of, can you lift the whole embargo or do you have to have Congress do it?
that's the dramatic difference with Vietnam. Bill Clinton had the authority to lift the embargo, and he did it before normalization of relations, which made the diplomatic relations much more meaningful than the kind of halfway situation that Obama faced of, on the one hand, we had normal diplomatic relations, and then on the other hand, we were still at war economically, because that, after all, is what an embargo is. And the Cubans noticed. For some strange reason, they noticed that that was going on. So I'm gonna do another poll, which is on follow-up as to what you're able to do yourself. Any last thoughts that people want to add to this discussion? Collin, Rita, Bill, are you?
No.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you're urging for final thoughts, not to beat a dead horse, but
only if there's a question, if you see a question that you want to deal with the question.
No, I just wanted to weigh in on the embassy issue and just make a couple of points. I think one, it's important to note that the majority of the U.S. diplomats that were in Havana around the time of these health incidents wanted to stay in Havana. And until this went public and really became toxified, if that's a word, there was good communication bilaterally. And, we've heard about how the FBI had pretty unfettered access and actually wanted more, and people in the administration were keeping them from coming down. And so politics got involved. And so I would say, I strongly agree, with both of you, but with Bill, that we probably won't solve this mystery, but I do think in a different political climate, there can be discussions to talk about these things and get assurances, to solve that issue. And I think that particularly because of the backlog with family reconciliation, there's a lot of Cubans at the border. There's a lot of Cubans in detention centers. It's a problem in terms of different priorities for the Biden administration and the type of policy that it wants to have more broadly on immigration and regional issues. And so I do think it's urgent for them to figure out the consular issue, and they'll have to have, discussions to figure it out. But I do think that that's possible. And then just one other, there was a comment in there about the San Isidro movement and kind of the cultural protests and whether that's going to make things more difficult for the Biden administration to engage. And I would say, absolutely not. I think that, the more the US kind of stays out of the way in terms of directly supporting or advocating for actors on the island to change things, the better for them and for their cause. And, where we've seen more of an opening economically and in terms of political plurality and more space for debate, which are supposedly the objectives of US policy, has been when we've, opened up travel and we've engaged in other ways. And so I do think that the folks, hopefully in the Biden administration, will get that, and they'll understand that allowing US telecom companies to engage, allowing Cubans to come to the US to study and to see their family and then return to the island, supporting a private sector and all of those things is better off in terms of our overall objectives on the island. And just one other point on that, I think that what happened at the Ministry of Culture was important, and it's ongoing. And it's a flourishing debate, within a small group of people, particularly on the internet and particularly in Havana. When you talk about the rising cost of electricity, that's 10.5 million or 11 million Cubans that are talking about that and are concerned about that. So I also, I would urge the Biden administration to really think about the well-being of the majority of Cubans, what's important, what's strategic for us. And, if Cuba's undergoing this potentially very destabilizing, very fragile currency, reform, somebody today on another call, I think it was Richard Feinberg, said, he's never seen a country in such a challenging economic environment undergo such a potentially, dangerous and destabilizing economic reform. And so, what is the objective of the Biden administration? Is it to try and bring more prosperity and gradual change to the island, or are we going to try and overthrow the government during a currency unification and deal with massive boat lifts and instability 90 miles off our coast? Doesn't seem like a smart objective for policymakers.
Great. I wanted to come back for a moment to the question of the Havana Syndrome. The Canadian argument is that it was chemical neurotoxins. Chemical neurotoxins could be in insecticide and inadvertently used, which provides a nice, comfortable, nobody was at fault, it was an unintended consequence explanation. The problem is that apparently those insecticides weren't used around the US residences, that the same ones the Canadians used. And that also leaves the issue of the people that were in the hotel rooms. All of those things could be explained if it was topical application of chemical neurotoxins. And we know who benefited from Trump's fleeing Cuba was his good friend in Moscow. And that happens to be the same people who have a great proclivity to use this kind of weapon. If in fact the Russians were behind it, and their goal was to force the Cubans into a closer relationship than the Cubans themselves wanted, then it could be a situation in which, whether it was ever said publicly, but which the two governments could come to an understanding of what the cause was and why it was never going to happen again. So, I mean, that's my bit of speculation, which I think is as valid as the National Academy of Sciences speculation, which, as the State Department said, was nothing more than speculation. So at any rate, that's an ongoing thing. Someone asked whether study abroad students could use support for the Cuban people. They can, but hopefully they won't have to. Rita, do you want to say something about it, or Collin? Have you run student programs using support for the Cuban people? Either of you?
I've run short student programs, like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but nothing semester long in that category. And it works, it's legal.
Okay. All righty. I think that unless somebody sees something else on the list, I'm sure there's some very specific questions that we'll try to send you notes to answer. Either I'll do it or one of the panelists may be able to do it. As I said, we will post and everyone will get the notice of the link for YouTube, and also for the chat. We'll post the chat and we will post the Q&A so that you can go back and get the links that were provided. The last poll that's running right now is to try to get a sense of how prepared people are to start going back into business with Cuba, whether that's student programs or sending commercial clients, normal travel, and we'll see where that gets. I think also I permanently get that information, and when I do that, I will share that with people too. And I just saved the chat. Sorry, I have to figure out all of this stuff as I'm doing it. So thank you, Greg, for co-sponsoring. I think CREST is an important feature in the whole travel milieu, and Cuba is but a little bit of it, but it's I'm glad that you consider it an important part of it.
And we'll continue to be, and we're looking forward to hopefully amplifying positive impacts
Right.
in a very short time period.
Well, one of the things I wrote to you about is that Ulises Aquino from Obra de la Calle was in Florida briefly, and he told me that they're planning on opening up their own travel business, which essentially means competitive with the Ministry of Culture's travel business. And I don't know whether there's been these stories saying that travel will become possible as a small and medium enterprise or as a cuenta propista legal category. And I don't know if Collin, you've been there in the week or two. Is there any sense that you have that that's opening, or is that still under discussion?
I think it's still under discussion. I think that's something that's happened for years, certainly kind of in the gray area. There's a lot of freelancers that are cuenta propistas that are working directly or indirectly with US travel. So I expect that minimally that will continue. And then depending on how all of these laws that Cuba is debating and introducing right now with, you know, small and medium-sized businesses and other aspects of reorganizing the economy, that I think there's a chance that that'll become more formalized and more legal. But again, I think we kind of have to wait and see. There's a lot going on right now, and kind of see how this shakes out in terms of sequencing and other factors, just how it goes. It's a very difficult and unpredictable time with the Cuban economy.
And is it your instinct that change in Cuba is affected positively by more openness in the US, or is some people argue that opening in the US means that Cuba won't make the hard decisions and bite the bullets that it has to make because it'll believe that the good old days are coming back?
I mean, I think there's, as you said, there's varying analyses. I think we just have to look at, I mean, one option is reading the tea leaves, and we can debate what we think. But I think if we look at fact, if you look at the most substantial changes in Cuba, in terms of the economy, but society overall, within the last 6 decades, happened, you know, mainly 2010, but starting in 2008, when Raul Castro officially becomes the president of Cuba, and, you know, 2008 to 2016 or so. And if you look at who was president in the United States and what his official, you know, discourse was towards Cuba, it was one of engagement and one of less hostility. And I think that clearly helped open up space on the island for very serious changes that took place. Are the changes that are taking place now a result of, you know, the economy being in a really bad place? Probably. Is some of that because of Trump sanctions? Probably. Is a lot of that because of COVID? Yes. But I think if you look at it within the context of the last 10 or 15 years, these are things that they said 10 years ago they were going to do. There was probably some political resistance. There was bureaucratic resistance. There was nervousness because they're so challenging. They're happening. And so I think it's up to U.S. policymakers to think about what's the best U.S. policy to facilitate, you know, the changes that we want, which is a more open society and a more open economy. And I think, you know, if you look at the facts, engagement has had that impact, and sanctions have not. They've been counterproductive and led to the opposite.
Great. I agree 100%. Rita, any final thoughts? You're muted. There you go.
I'm dealing with a very loud barking dog outside my window. No, I mean, the best thing that anyone can do right now for Cuba is start traveling and get here as soon as possible, and start pushing a little bit of money into the economy here and into the hands of the Cuban people. It has been a really, really hard year and a half for everyone here. And the pandemic, although we do see an end in sight, my sister-in-law yesterday received the vaccine in New York, so I'm very excited about that. And as people get vaccinated and begins travel, make sure that you, as travel professionals, specifically have Cuba at the forefront. It is a country that is just magical. Most of you know that already, but it's so important to get down here and support tourism and support the Cuban people at this moment and throughout the coming year. Thank you very much for having me.
Yep. Bill?
I would just say that, those of you in the audience who, support an opening to travel and a restarting the relationship of engagement with Cuba, let the Biden administration know, and let your congressional representatives know about it, because the more that the administration hears from outside constituents and the more they hear from Democratic members of Congress and even some Republican members of Congress, that this is something that's in the interest of the United States and in the interests of the Cuban people, the more likely they are to do it and do it soon.
Yeah. They are continuing to raise funds, I notice, from my inbox for the inauguration or for whatever reasons, which means I don't know if any of those things afford opportunities to say, as someone who voted for you, I'm waiting for, or someone who's donating, I'm waiting for you to deliver on the Cuba. I'd note that on the last poll, certainly this is not entirely indicative because it has a smaller number for planning trips for clients and for students, but that may reflect the percentages of the people who are on at that particular time. But certainly the personal trips are high on the response level, and that's what, again, a quick decision by the Biden people could provide for, that as soon as it becomes easily legal and as soon as people are prepared to travel within the COVID situation, then obviously there's a backup of interest that would help to respond to Rita's appeal. So thank you very much to everybody. There was again a strong response that once there is a new information, that we should do another one of these, and hopefully we'll be able to do that in a month or so, and everybody will be informed about it. So I think I have to now hit a button that ends the call, which means I have to get these other things out of the way. And okay, there we go. So goodbye, everyone, and have a nice weekend. We're Thursday, so a nice weekend is coming up. And if you're in the snow belt, enjoy it. Bye-bye. And we wish we weren't in this. We wish we weren't in the snow belt and we're with Rita and Collin at this particular moment.